Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Methodantics. This is something that we started to investigate dusty ideas, is what we call it. We know that throughout the history of the church and this thing that we've come to know and love as worship has a long and rich history. And some of these things were new ideas at some point, and some of them are ideas that have become, as we say, dusty over time. They're things that maybe haven't been explored or we just don't talk about enough. And I am Justin Bair. I am an associate director of worship and music. And I started working at St. Luke's in 2019. Sid said, you should come be our worship coordinator. And I said, great, how do you do that? And so in this process of learning how to do the job itself, I've still very much been in the process of learning how to do worship, what all this stuff is called and why it's so important. And so part of why we started Methodantics is so that I can learn a lot of these things, and mostly at the feet of Sid Davis, who will introduce himself, and our guest for today.
We'll talk about at the feet of later on. But I'm Sid Davis. I'm Director of Music and Fine Arts at St. Luke's. And I'm happy to be here with my friend Justin and our friend Dr. Mark Stamm, who is a professor at Perkins School of Theology in Dallas, where I have, even though I was never a full-time student there, I was part of church music summer seminar for 32 years. I kept doing it until I got it right. Maybe didn't even do it then, but it was the most wonderful and formative thing for me as a church musician. I wish it was still going on. We asked Dr. Stamm to be with us today because his teaching specialties, and I'm reading here off my phone, Christian worship, theology, and practice of sacraments within Methodism, and has written many books. He's an author. And how long have you been at Perkins, Mark?
Well, Sid, and thank you for the invitation. I want to give my greeting to all the good folks at St. Luke's, your staff, your membership, many of whom I know. And anyway, so I am now amazingly in my 21st year at Perkins. So I came in the summer of 2000 after 17 years in primarily parish work in mostly in central Pennsylvania. So
very good.
Yeah.
Well, we have some questions lined up. Justin's always good about doing that. As I have said many times to the people who follow us in Methodantics, having been raised Southern Baptist, I knew nothing of liturgy and have just been striving to learn about it all these years. And I think it's fascinating. I operate by, I use the sentence, which I believe is Dr. Willimon, who said it's the church's job to help us pay attention. And I think the liturgical year does that so beautifully. And yet we just assume that people know what it is and how it came about and why we do it. So all of our questions about that today. Justin, you want to start?
Sure. So I think a healthy place for us to start, partially in helping us to get to know you a little bit better, but then kind of introducing the topic, is we're going to be talking a lot about the liturgical year, liturgical calendar. And so I wanted to start by asking, how did you maybe grow an interest in that, and or who influenced you in your studies to learn about how all of this worked and how we practice this?
Yeah. Well, thank you for that, Justin. I'm a church kid from the start, so I can remember. I'm a preacher's kid. I can remember being in church very, very early on. Learned the John Murbeck chants in the old communion service, sitting by my mother in church, really listening to her sing them. So it goes way back for me, as deeply as I can remember, and I always liked being around church. So that's kind of foundational. Now, in terms of learning, so much of what I learned about the Christian year was, as it were, imbibed, along the way. I sang in choirs, youth choir, and the full church choir when I was even in junior high and high school. So sang Christmas cantatas and Easter cantatas, sang from the Messiah while I was still in junior high. All of much of that formation. So much of it, kind of was imbibed. Now, in terms of in terms of more formal learning on this, I want to credit a couple people. The supplemental worship resources were beginning to emerge in the mid to late 1970s, and I was reading some of those. Some of my professors along the way. I spent a couple years at Asbury in the early 80s. Don Boyd, not many people know about him, had us reading books like Seasons of the Gospel, which was one of the texts. Had us looking at things like Ashes to Fire. Handbook for the Church Year came out, around then, I think. And then I worked with Larry Stuckey when I was at Wesley Theological Seminary, which is where I eventually graduated. And Dr. Stuckey was teaching us quite a lot and writing quite a lot about the Christian year. Began celebrating after graduations from seminary. Began celebrating the Easter Vigil with a fellow by the name of Guy Camp, who was member of the Order of St. Luke in Central Pennsylvania Conference. I really kind of moved toward the order through Brother Guy. So a group of pastors got together to learn the Easter Vigil by doing it, every year. And then finally, I want to credit a whole lot of it, though, to my professor at Boston University in my doctoral work, Horace T. Allen Jr., actually a Presbyterian, a wonderful Presbyterian, formed in the tradition of Iona. Horace was actually warden at Iona for a time in the 1960s. Horace formally taught me quite a lot about the Christian year. Particularly helped me see how Lent and Easter are connected deeply to the whole process of Christian initiation. So those are some of the key sources, and I keep learning from a lot of people. So
that as a person, and in a sense, we're just the opposite. You grew up; it is in your DNA.
Mm-hmm.
And I grew up every Sunday in church. I didn't sit by my mother because she was always in the choir, but I knew, as I said, I knew nothing of liturgy. And one of my first questions was, where did all this come from? And I think for the people in the pew, that's a question, whether it's crystallized and asked or not. Clearly, Jesus didn't leave a lesson plan for the liturgical calendar. We came up with all this, but how did it begin?
Well, a very good observation there that I think it's important to know, as you said, no blueprint that provided by Jesus. Like I like to say, no New Testament book of worship, right? There are fragments that we use and building blocks, as it were, that we use, but the church has developed these things, and that's very important to say, which is one of the reasons why there are there's a diversity of forms, right? In terms of how the church has done this. So it's not as if you keep Lent, you're right, and if you don't, you're wrong. That's not the right way to think about it. There can be a lot of different ways in which these matters are discerned. But let's go back to just a real basic theory about the development of Lent, for instance. So if we think of Lent, it's important. Most scholars would agree now that it's important to link Lent with baptism, that is, with preparation for baptism. Right? If you look, if you look to the again to the source pieces, if you look to New Testament accounts of baptism, they're somewhat spare, as I said, no New Testament book of worship, but in every case, you see some nod to some teaching in relation to baptism. People will even bring up sometimes the Ethiopian eunuch and Philip riding in the chariot, and the eunuch looking over and said, "Oh, see, there's water." But even in that story, it talks about them riding along in the chariot, talking about the scriptures. So really in pretty much all of the cases of New Testament discussion of baptism, there is some nod to some teaching. Okay, so we need to keep that as a piece. And so as various baptismal ordos began to develop, usually there was some kind of teaching. Now the speculation is Paul Bradshaw and Maxwell Johnson in their book on the origins of feasts and fasts in the church speculate that there may have been an early 18 session, as Johnson calls it, free-floating time of formation in the church, prior to baptism. Now he bases this, part of his basis for this theory is the catechetical lectures of St. Cyril of Jerusalem, of which there are 18, right?
I wonder where it came from.
Yeah, and that was kind of the kernel of what eventually developed into Lent as this time when there was final teaching given to the catechumens. So the kernel of Lent is this desire for the church to teach. Now, teach what? Well, primarily the scriptures. That's always the foundation of what we teach. But as Lent developed, there was also some teaching on the creed. That is, what we would think of as the Apostles' Creed today. Also, some teaching on prayer. So there was developed the tradition of the handing over of the Lord's Prayer. Again, the work that was done for those who were candidates for baptism was this basic scriptural teaching, and some instruction eventually in the creed and in the life of prayer prior to baptism. Now, and the thing you see developing early on, earlier on, you get into the 4th century. There's this wonderful woman, nun by the name of Egeria. Look up Egeria's Travels. You can find translations of this on the internet. Although if you want to find a really fine recent scholarly piece on this, The Pilgrimage of Egeria by Anne McGowan and Paul Bradshaw is excellent, and I commend it. You have to buy that one though if you want to have that one. But anyway, so Egeria was this 4th century nun from Spain who took a pilgrimage to the Holy Land, and much to the delight of contemporary scholars, she kept a diary, much of which we have. And so she has these wonderful descriptions of what was going on in 4th century Jerusalem. Now, through her perspective, of course, so we have to always realize this is one very deeply committed religious person's understanding or perspective on what was going on there. But she describes how the candidates for baptism were brought during Lent around the bishop's chair in the martyrium. Now, if you've been to Jerusalem, this is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre now. Only in those days it was an open court. And she talks about how those to be baptized that year actually participated in biblical instruction from the bishop 3 hours a day, all through Lent, Sundays excluded. kind of discipleship, kind of disciple Bible study on steroids in a sense, 3 hours a day. But what's interesting is she describes not only the people to be baptized, but she talks about the fathers and mothers and others coming back, in subsequent years to hear the teaching again. And so there you get a sense of Lent being not just for those to be baptized, but for all of the church, which, we need to keep hearing these stories again and again and again. And that tends to get a little closer to what our experience is today.
So new Christians would go through this intense, they could have almost gotten a degree, with that much Bible study.
Right.
They would be baptized on Easter.
Correct.
So there we have the first building block, we think, for the Christian year. What's next?
Yeah. Actually, the next piece, actually, I think it's fair to say that the first building block of the Christian year was actually Easter.
Of course.
Okay. Easter being the first piece, which of course is, in fact, many early Christians called it Pascha, which is still the name you'll hear if you get around Greek Orthodox folk. They'll, they won't say Easter, generally speaking. They may translate for you, but generally they're going to say Pascha, which is understood as the Christian Passover, right? So there's this sort of equation of Passover with Easter, that Easter is our Passover, from death to life. And so early on, the church celebrated Easter, and celebrated it even before there was a Lent. Remember I said that this 3-week period maybe was kind of a floater. Didn't necessarily, the church did it when they needed to, right? There's some speculation that in Alexandria, it may have, what we now think of as Lent may actually have occurred post-Epiphany, which actually makes some sense, because the focus of Epiphany was the baptism of the Lord. It wasn't necessarily the three magi. It was the baptism of the Lord. And so it makes sense, when you follow that narrative of Jesus being baptized and going into the wilderness and spending the 40 days in the wilderness, that the as it were, imitation of that would follow post-Epiphany. So there's some speculation that it may have happened then. And then when Easter became a preferred time for baptism, primarily because of the Romans 6 text about dying and rising with Christ, Easter became a preferred time. Lent was, or that preparatory period was actually moved to its current space today. Now that didn't happen last week. That move was pretty well accomplished by the middle of the 4th century. So it's been where it is now for a long time. But Easter was first, okay? So we just want to say that. And then you get, in terms of Easter. So, well, let me back up just a little bit. So much of this understanding of Lent has been in recovery now in Methodism, and really not just Methodism, but a number of denominations, including Rome. Kind of a reappropriation of the depth and possibility of the Christian year. One of the things we have noticed is that we have had a considerable recovery of Lent now in Methodism over the last generation or two. Probably the underdeveloped piece has been Eastertide, right? So here's some other evidence from Egeria and the early church. Egeria in the 4th century also speaks of what happened to to what she calls the infants. Now, the infants were not necessarily little babies. When she's talking about infants, she's speaking theologically at this point of the infants. Remember, another image for baptism is that we are born again in Christ through our baptism, new birth by water and the Spirit, to use the language that we use liturgically. So in a sense, we're newborns. Whether a person is baptized when they're 40 days old, or when they're 40 years old, or whenever they are a newborn, needing the nurture and support of the church. Okay, so Egeria talks about some particular focus that was made on the infants, especially in the first week or two after Easter. And from some other sources, I'm going to switch out from Egeria now, going back to St. Cyril in his mystagogical catechesis. Now, I'm going to give you a word there. To mystagogy means reflection on the mysteries. So those people who had been through the intense pre-baptismal work, now it's possible that the first baptism they saw would have been their own, or the first communion that they saw would have been their first. And so what the church did after Easter was to do mystagogy with them, reflection on what had happened. Okay. In other words, what on earth did God do with you at your baptism? What is beginning to happen to you now that you are receiving communion? What does that mean for you? What will that mean for you? Known as mystagogy, and that was the great agenda item for Eastertide, also known as the Great 50 Days, a period that stretched from Easter Sunday, what we think of as Easter, but Easter Sunday, through the day of Pentecost. Just as Lent has been a time of fasting and preparation, so Eastertide was a time of celebration, and again, reflection on what it is that God did, in and through baptism. And in the same way, so Egeria talks about accompanying the infants, as it were. It wasn't just that this reflection was done with the newly baptized. Again, we see evidence of the church taking part in this as well. The church coming together to reflect on what it means to be a baptized child of God. And again, I think this is something that's worth our attention. We are baptized in an instant, on a day, but we spend the rest of our life, or potentially can spend the rest of our life, understanding what that means, living into the implications of that. What does it mean that I belong to Christ through baptism? What is the shape of this gift I've been given in baptism, and what is the call that's inherent in that gift? What does God expect of me? What can I do as a result of that? What should I do as a result of that? So and again, that's, I think, why the church accompanied. That's why the church accompanied them on this baptismal journey, because again, we never get finished learning what the implications of all this are.
Justin and I have, not maybe in these exact words, but we've had a long ongoing conversation. We don't do mystery well in the 21st century.
Yeah.
That's not only uncomfortable, but amorphous and hard.
mystery sounds like a problem to be solved. And if we're sort of dwelling in mystery, then we're not working hard enough to figure it out.
Well, right. And
Too bad.
Yeah. What do I want to say about that? If we are talking about an encounter with God, right, which we are here, if the God of justice and love, the great eternal one, creator of the universe, all those titles that we would want to give to God, if the sacraments and the sacramental life is based on an encounter with God, and we believe that they are, right? If that's the case, then we can never get to the bottom of it, right? We can, doesn't matter how far we go, we won't get to the bottom. Now, that doesn't mean we can't understand things, right? Part of intellectual reflection, I think, involves both a curiosity and a humility, right? About many of these things. And so curiosity leads us to want to understand, and there's much that we can know. Say, for instance, for a good Lenten question, if we're gonna say that this whole pattern has to do with baptism, so you go back to the questions that we always ask at baptism, at least the questions that are listed in the hymnal and in the church's order for baptism. So we ask a question like, and you ask this question either of a person who can answer for him or herself, or we ask it of sponsors. But we ask, do you accept the freedom and power God gives you to resist evil, injustice, and oppression in whatever forms they present themselves? Pretty clear question. I'll repeat it. Do you accept the freedom and power God gives you to resist evil, injustice, and oppression in whatever forms they present themselves? Now, we can together, and we should, ask ourselves, okay, where is the evil and injustice that we need to resist? And we can begin to name that, can't we? Right? It's tricky politically, but we can begin to name some of that. We can name racism. Let's just sit there for a little bit. We can name that as an affront to the gospel, right? As a denial of the gospel, as a denial of the God who in baptism says there are no distinctions any longer, who welcomes all of us into the one body of Christ through baptism. We can name that as an evil, and then we can begin to ask ourselves, okay, what would resistance to that look like? That's a tricky question. It's a question that it's not a safe question, right? It's a question that can end in some arguments, but it's an important question for us to ask. What does resistance look like? How do we as church live according to a vision that is different than that resists that oppression? And when you do that, you can begin to talk about some very specific things that we might do, as church. Those are Lenten questions, and those are questions whereby we can discern together carefully what resistance might look like. Now, you'll never get to the bottom of that, because the work of resisting evil and oppression, will have a new face in 20 years that we don't even know about yet. And conversely, I don't want to just speak of this as some grim enterprise. The grace of God to to allow us to see possibilities and move to places beyond that oppression, to the ability of God's grace to allow us to live in freedom, right, and joy and peace together. That is a well with no bottom, right? There is this grace of God that continues to work in the church, and again, we'll never see the bottom of that. Of that source of grace. So yeah, mystery, right? And reflection on the mysteries, but that doesn't mean we can't know some things and come to some decisions. Does that make sense what I'm saying there? So
Wonderful.
Yeah.
I could listen to this all day long. I know you don't have all day long, and we probably can't touch on every aspect of the Christian year in our last few minutes that we have. What do you think came? I mean, was there a clear, was Advent sort of next in its birth?
Yeah. Okay. So this would be somewhat counterintuitive, but it appears that the last piece of the Christian year to take shape was in fact Christmas. Okay? You have in Pascha, Easter, and Pentecost, you have precedent of Jewish feasts, in those cases. Christmas, not the case. Okay. It developed. You begin to see Christmas there in again mid to late 4th century. Interestingly enough, John Chrysostom talks about Christmas being relatively new, in the 4th century. It doesn't mean that they didn't have the birth narratives in the church; they had them before, but in terms of it being a feast, that was relatively late. And it appears that the Christmas feast developed, primarily for theological reasons, to assert in the life of the church that the one born in Bethlehem was indeed the Son of God, that the second person of the Trinity had indeed been incarnate in our midst. That was and that he was both God, and fully human. That was the theological agenda driving Christmas, and so Christmas was last. And this is going to sound like the proverbial broken record, but it appears that Advent originally may also have been a pre-baptismal season to prepare people for baptism at Epiphany. Epiphany actually is older than Christmas. So it goes back to Christian initiation again. Now, if you look at my profile, my specialty has been Christian initiation. So it may be that I tend to see things through these lenses, but nevertheless, no. It appears that that Advent may have begun for that reason as well. Now, when we talk about origins, we have to be careful, however, to realize that even if these feasts and seasons began with Christian initiation in view, that doesn't mean that has to be the only agenda for them now, right? Just as the church, well, quite frankly, invented Lent, for good biblical reasons, but the form we invented, and just as we invent Advent, it's up to us to continue to reshape it. One of the things I don't know if that's answering your question or not, but
yes.
But and also I would just commend to people as they think of Advent. one of the early emphases of Advent and continuing emphases in Advent is again, for another fancy word, eschatology, right? Advent is not that, that is last things, eschatos. Advent is not simply preparing for Christmas,
right?
As important as that is. But Advent is a preparing for the coming of the Lord. And
much harder to talk about.
although quite interesting to talk about, right? Because and this is one of these places where maybe a theological theme has been hijacked by a certain theological and ecclesiastical perspective from which we want to distance ourselves. That is focusing on the so-called second coming, of Christ, and the mischief that sometimes attaches to that in terms of some of the rapture theology that you'll hear, which again we may have problems with, rightly so. But if we could develop a more sophisticated understanding of what it means to pray for the coming of Christ, and for that I would refer you back to the Great Thanksgiving. And in the Great Thanksgiving, we have this piece toward the end called the Memorial Acclamation, in which we say, "Therefore, let us proclaim the mystery of faith." And we say, we could all repeat it together: Christ has died, Christ is risen, Christ will come again. Then notice there, the very next thing that happens in the Eucharistic prayer in the Great Thanksgiving is the pastor prays, "Pour out your Holy Spirit upon us and upon these gifts. Make them be for us the body and blood of Christ, that we may be for the world the body of Christ, redeemed by his blood." So there's this two parallel petition prayer known as the Epiclesis, the calling upon, which happens right after we say Christ will come again. So in a sense, we're saying that we're making a rather bold claim there, that through the prayer that Christ comes in our midst and in each other as we celebrate Holy Communion together. So there is this coming of Christ, which happens in that way. So kind of the Eucharistic coming, and that pertains not just to the bread and wine or juice sitting on the altar, but to each other, because we are the body of Christ and individually members of it. So there's that. There is, when we're talking about the coming of Christ, we are talking about the coming of Christ at the end of the age. As we say in the Creed, he will come again in glory to judge the living and the dead. There is that, and that's back to that word, something of a mystery, right? And Jesus said, "Let it go." Of the day or hour, only the Father knows, right? Know it, believe it, but in a sense, let it go. And then there's the coming of Christ in the manger in Bethlehem. So all of these things speak to Christ's coming. It is kind of out there in the future, but it's here now too. And I think that's the better way to speak of the themes of Advent, to talk about all these ways that Christ comes and appears. I think this is moving maybe a little bit far afield, but I think when we talk in the Creed about him coming to judge the living and the dead, if we think of that simply as something way out in the future, we've maybe missed the point. Because every time we gather together to hear the word, every time we gather together to pray, that is a moment of judgment and grace all at the same time. Now, by judgment, I did not say judgmental. I said judgment, where we may realize through the preaching of the word that I need to turn more fully to God. I need to have a deeper respect for my neighbor. I need to love my neighbor in this concrete way. I have not been doing it, and I need to do better with this. But we are judged in that moment by being shown the fact that our life is lacking. But in that same moment, we can do something about that because of the grace of God.
Yeah. Mark, we have only just a very few more minutes. We always end, first of all, again, I could listen to this all day long.
I'm so glad we're recording this, because as soon as Grace publishes it, I'm just going to go back and watch it again. So take better notes.
For those days at Perkins, I think I knew how lucky I was, but I'd like to go back and experience it again. We always end with a question that lets people in on our sort of who we are, and Justin's going to pose that question for us.
So I think it's been anything from, food we've eaten recently and what's going on in our lives to more sort of personal history things. And so today, since we have a professor of Christian theology and worship, we're going to ask, what is your education background? What is our education background? So for me, I grew up in a non-denominational background, and I went to a non-denominational small Christian college called Dallas Christian College. My degree was, it was called music ministry at the time. It's since kind of evolved a little, but it was a double major in Bible and music. So that was my undergrad. And then in about 2010, I went to Fuller Theological Seminary for a Master of Arts in Theology. And I started that and continued. I started it full time and then continued it part time as I was a choir director in public schools, and wondering the whole time, should I be finishing this? I guess I should. I've started it. I'll just go ahead and finish it. But I'm directing choirs in public schools, and this is very much a place where I am now, where I feel like this is the reason that I finished, and I'm so glad that I did.
I'm pretty much music all the way. I started as history major, but then saw the error of my ways and music major. And I credit Perkins and all those summers. That was hugely educational for me, informative for me. So you're from Pennsylvania, started school in Pennsylvania.
I did, in fact, and went to third generation in my family on my mother's side to go to a school in Shippensburg, Pennsylvania, which is about 25 miles over the mountain west from Gettysburg, right? Now Shippensburg University, part of the Pennsylvania State University system, where I was an English major with training in secondary education. So I learned to write. My composition teacher there had Dean Koontz in class 10 years before. So you may know him, the fantasy writer, also with Pennsylvania roots. So I learned to write there, learned to teach, and learned to love literature. So it was an English major there, but heard the call to ministry in the midst of that time. Then I went to Asbury Theological Seminary in Wilmore, Kentucky for 2 years, transferred back and took a church in the Central Pennsylvania Conference and finished at Wesley Theological Seminary. That may be a bit mind-boggling geographically for folks from Texas, but you can be in Southern Pennsylvania, close to the border in Southern Pennsylvania, and be about 75 miles from Washington, D.C., believe it or not. And so I finished at Wesley Theological Seminary, where I ran into Larry Stuckey and had a great experience there. Was in parish ministry for a while after that, and then went to Boston University School of Theology, where I took a Doctor of Theology degree with primary emphasis on liturgy and liturgical history. So that's my educational background. Graduated with that in 1995.
We are so glad you did all that, because you brought this giant gift to us today and enlightened many, many people on sort of the iceberg of the liturgical year. There's, for us, there's a little bit sticking up above the water, but what is below the water is massive.
Mhm.
So we're so grateful to you for all of this imparting of knowledge, and we will only enjoy in the real sense the Christian year even more, having known all this. Thank you, Mark, so much.
My pleasure, and blessings to all of you on your continued work at St. Luke's.
Thank you so much. Have a good day.
You too. Thank you.
Bye.